Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into something that, well, it probably touches almost everyone with an Apple device, maybe even folks who don't own one directly.
Hmm.
We're talking about potential hidden security weaknesses in the tech we use every single day.
Yeah, it's pretty fundamental stuff.
And this deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly. They're leaders in enterprise storage, backup, disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
Right.
So if you're looking for really secure, ransomware-proof storage, think air-gapped, immutable options, you can contact sales at stonefly.com to set up a demo.
Good to know.
Yeah.
So yeah, today we're digging into a set of newly discovered vulnerabilities. They affect Apple's AirPlay protocol.
AirPlay, right, the streaming thing.
Exactly. And not just AirPlay itself, but also the software kit, the SDK, that lets tons of third-party devices work with it.
Okay.
These flaws, they've been collectively named AirBorne.
AirBorne. Okay, that name definitely catches your attention. Sort of hints at how it spreads.
Precisely. It reflects the wireless nature, over Wi-Fi, and also the potential for these things to spread quite easily.
So what's the actual worry? Like, what's the worst case scenario here?
Well, the core issue is that these vulnerabilities could potentially let someone unauthorized gain control over, honestly, a huge range of devices.
Like what kind of devices?
We're talking iPhones, Macs, Apple TVs, even CarPlay systems in cars. And then there's the whole universe of third-party speakers and receivers that have AirPlay built in.
Wow, that covers a lot of ground. So to taking control, does that mean I have to click on a dodgy link or something?
That's the really unsettling part about some of these. There's potential for what we call zero-click remote code execution.
Zero click, meaning?
Meaning your device could be compromised without you doing anything. No tapping, no clicking, nothing. It could just happen silently.
Okay, that is genuinely unnerving. Just sitting there, and someone could potentially get in.
Potentially, yes. That's the risk identified. It really shifts how you have to think about security, doesn't it? You can do everything right and still be vulnerable.
Absolutely. So who found these? Where did this research come from?
This was work done by researchers at a security firm, Oligo Security. They did a pretty deep dive into AirPlay and uncovered these significant weaknesses.
And significant really means significant here, given the number of devices.
Oh, absolutely. Apple itself has, what, over 2 billion active devices out there?
Yeah, something like that.
And then you add all the third-party gear using the AirPlay SDK.
Yeah.
The potential scale is just enormous. Billions, potentially.
Right. Okay, back to the AirBorne name. You said it hints at spreading easily. Is that like a computer worm type of situation?
That's exactly one of the major concerns. By chaining some of these vulnerabilities together, CVE-2025-24252 and CVE-2025-24132 in particular.
Okay, the technical names.
Right, sorry. One's a use after free flaw, mainly on Mac OS. The other is a stack buffer overflow in the SDK, hitting third-party stuff in CarPlay.
Use after free, buffer overflow. Basically ways to trick the system into running bad code.
Exactly. And the worry is, if you combine these, you could create wormable exploits.
Wormable means?
Meaning, once one device on a network gets infected, it could automatically try to infect other vulnerable AirPlay devices on that same network. No more clicks needed.
So my infected laptop could then infect my smart speaker or my Apple TV just because they're on the same Wi-Fi.
That's the potential scenario, yes. And think about bigger networks.
It's an office.
Yeah, or even just moving between networks.
Yeah.
They described a scenario, right? Imagine your MacBook gets compromised, say, on public Wi-Fi in a coffee shop.
Okay.
Then you take that same laptop into your company's office network. Now, that compromised machine could become a gateway, potentially spreading the infection inside the corporate network.
Wow. So your personal device becomes the entry point. That's a big worry for companies.
It really blurs the lines between personal and enterprise security.
Were there other examples? You mentioned CarPlay earlier.
Yes. The CarPlay scenario is interesting because it's often broadcasting. Attackers nearby, maybe in another car or just walking past, could potentially try to hijack the car's infotainment system.
Hijack it how? Like change the music?
Could be that, or displaying unwanted stuff. But more concerningly, they raise the possibility of eavesdropping on conversations inside the car through the system's microphone.
Okay, that's definitely crossing a line into serious privacy invasion.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned earlier that even some built-in AirPlay security settings might not fully protect against this.
That's another key finding. You know how you can set AirPlay permissions to current user only or require a password?
Yeah, try to lock it down a bit.
Well, Oligo demonstrated potential ways to bypass even those restrictions in some cases. So setting those permissions helps, it reduces risk, but it might not be a foolproof shield against these specific flaws.
Okay, so zero-click takeover, wormable spreading. Were there other types of vulnerabilities found besides these really severe ones?
Yes, definitely. They found other significant issues too. One was the ability to read files locally, arbitrarily.
Meaning, if they're already on the device somehow.
Right. So if an attacker has some initial foothold, maybe through a different method, this specific flaw, CVE-2025-24270, could let them read files belonging to, say, other users on the same Mac, private documents, things like that.
Ouch. And what about sensitive information leaking out?
Yeah, there were flaws related to sensitive information disclosure, things like potentially Wi-Fi network credentials or other private data being exposed over the network, stuff you definitely don't want out there.
Definitely not. And of course, the classic denial of service attacks, just crashing things.
Yep, those were in the mix too, including one that could remotely crash the device's whole user interface.
Crash the UI, what happens then?
It essentially forces the user to be logged out. And that disruption, besides being annoying, could potentially open a window for man-in-the-middle attacks.
How so?
Well, they gave this example. Imagine a board meeting. CEO is presenting using AirPlay to the big screen.
Okay.
Attacker uses the DOS flaw to crash the AirPlay receiver on that screen. Now it's offline.
Right.
The attacker could then try to spoof the TV's identity, maybe make their own device look like the trusted screen. So when the CEO tries to reconnect...
They connect to the attacker's device instead, and the attacker gets the presentation.
Exactly. Capturing potentially confidential information. It shows how even a simple crash can be leveraged for something more malicious in the right context.
That's a very clever and worrying scenario. So let's get a tiny bit technical, but keep it accessible. What's actually happening in AirPlay that allows these flaws?
Okay, so AirPlay mainly uses network port 7000, and it communicates using its own special language, API. It's kind of a mix of web stuff, HTTP, and media streaming stuff, RTSP.
Port 7000, got it.
And a really key part of this communication is something Apple uses a lot. Property lists, or just pull lists.
Lists, heard of those. They're like configuration files.
Sort of, yeah. In this context, think of them as structured messages. They carry the commands and the data, the parameters, that one AirPlay device sends to another. Like, play this song or show this photo.
Okay, so they're the instructions.
Exactly. And many of these vulnerabilities seem to stem from flaws in how the receiving device processes these plists. If it makes a mistake interpreting the instructions.
The attacker can slip in bad instructions.
That's the idea. Errors in parsing or handling the data in those plists can lead to crashes, or worse, allow attackers to execute their own code.
And you mentioned type confusion earlier. Is that related to these plists?
Yes, CVE-2025-24129 was an example. Type confusion is when the program expects one type of data in the plus say. It's expecting a number, but it receives something different, like text. If it doesn't handle that mismatch correctly, it can get confused, crash, or again, potentially be exploited. It's about messing with the expected structure of those plus messages.
It sounds incredibly detailed. How did the researchers even start looking at AirPlay so closely? Was there a specific reason?
It was apparently a bit indirect, actually. They were initially scanning networks for open ports related to a different previous vulnerability.
Okay.
And during that scan, they just noticed that port 7000, the AirPlay port, was open and accessible on a lot of devices. Surprisingly widespread exposure.
Just sitting there, open.
Yeah. And they also found that many of the AirPlay protocol commands seemed to be usable without much restriction, even in default setups. That combination, the open port and the accessible commands, kind of piqued their interest.
Made them think, maybe we should dig into this a bit deeper.
Exactly. It led them to perform this more focused, in-depth analysis of AirPlay security. Sometimes discoveries happen that way, right? You're looking for one thing and stumble onto something else entirely.
It's amazing how that happens. Okay, so the big question now, the really crucial one. What can we, as users, actually do about AirBorne? How do we protect ourselves?
Right. The absolute number one thing, the most critical step, is updates. Apply the latest security updates from Apple.
For everything.
For everything. iPhones, iPads, Macs, Apple TVs, Vision Pros, watches. Apple released patches in early 2025. You're looking for iOS 18.4, macOS Sequoia 15.4, and the equivalent versions for tvOS, watchOS, visionOS.
So iOS 18.4, macOS 15.4, and so on. If you see an update notification, install it immediately.
Absolutely. That's your main line of defense. These updates directly address the vulnerabilities Oligo found.
Okay, updates first. What else? Are there other practical steps?
Yes. Another really simple but effective one, turn off the AirPlay receiver function on your devices when you're not actually using it.
You can just switch it off in settings?
Usually, yes. In system settings on Mac or settings on iOS iPadOS. If the receiver isn't listening, it dramatically reduces the attack surface for these kinds of wireless exploits.
Makes sense. If it's off, they can't talk to it.
Pretty much.
What about network level stuff like firewalls?
Yeah, if you're comfortable managing your network router or firewall, you could implement rules to restrict traffic on port 7000.
Restricted how?
Ideally, only allow connections on port 7000 from devices or network segments you explicitly trust. It adds another layer, preventing potentially malicious connection attempts from even reaching your devices.
Okay, that's maybe more for tech-savvy users, but good to know it's an option. And those AirPlay permissions we talked about earlier, current user only and stuff.
Definitely review those. Setting permissions to current user or requiring a password or on-screen code is still a good practice. As we said, it might not block everything related to AirBorne according to the research.
Right, the potential bypasses.
But it certainly reduces the general risk and limits who can easily try to connect. It's about layers of security.
Updates, turn off when not needed, firewall rules, tighten permissions. Got it. Now, Apple patched their stuff. What about all those third-party speakers and TVs using the AirPlay SDK?
Yeah. That's a really significant point and potentially a long-term problem. Apple did patch the SDK and presumably made it available to manufacturers.
Yes.
But the whole update ecosystem for third-party devices is, well, it's fragmented. It's all over the place.
You mean manufacturers might be slow to release updates, or maybe never release them for older devices?
Exactly that. Some manufacturers are great, others are slow, and for devices that are a few years old, they might just never get patched. This could leave a lot of non-Apple gear vulnerable for potentially a very long time.
So if you have a smart speaker or a TV from another brand that uses AirPlay,
You should definitely check the manufacturer's website or support channels for any firmware updates specifically mentioning security or AirPlay fixes.
and if there are no updates,
Then you have a harder decision. You might need to consider disabling the AirPlay functionality on that device, especially if it's on a network you need to keep secure, or just be aware of the potential risk.
that really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? A flaw in one company's core tech ripples out across so many different products.
It really does. These airborne flaws are a stark reminder, I think, of how interconnected everything is and how a vulnerability can have such a wide blast radius, potentially compromising personal and work devices silently.
Especially that zero-click aspect. That's the part that sticks with you.
It emphasizes that we can't just rely on being careful about what we click. We need the underlying systems to be secure, and we need to apply updates promptly.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the action items for everyone listening. Number 1, update your Apple devices now. iOS 18.4, macOS Sequoia 15.4, etc.
Crucial, yeah.
Number 2, consider turning off the AirPlay receiver function in settings when you're not using it.
Good practical step.
Number 3, if you can, look into firewall rules for port 7000.
That's another layer.
And number 4, check and tighten those AirPlay permissions. Current user only, passwords, that kind of thing.
Yep, reduce the risk. And maybe check for updates on your third-party AirPlay devices, too.
Right, absolutely. Don't forget those. Taking these steps should significantly lower your exposure.
It should make a real difference, yes.
You know, wrapping this up, it really does make you pause and think, doesn't it? About how many interconnected devices we have now and how one single flaw, like these airborne ones, can potentially cascade through our digital lives.
It's a constant evolution. Security isn't a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process of vigilance, updates, and awareness. Thinking about how these things link together is becoming more and more important.
Definitely something to keep in mind. Well, this has been a really important deep dive, and remember, it was brought to you by Stonefly,
Right.
leaders in enterprise storage, backup, DR, AI storage, and cloud solutions. If secure, ransomware-proof storage with air-gapped and immutable options sounds good, check them out. Contact sales at stonefly.com for a demo.
Good advice for anyone needing serious storage security.
Thanks for joining us today.